So brands, when they get it right, can be these beacons of trust in today's world, and they still hold this latent potential. I think it's 81% of people today believe that global brands have the power to make the world better.
Hi, this is Andy North, and this is Velocitize Talks. I'm joined today by India Wooldridge, SVP Director with McCann Truth Central. India, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So let's just jump right in. Tell me a little bit about McCann Truth Central.
Sure. So McCann Truth Central is McCann World Group's global proprietary research unit, and we've been in existence for about 7 years. And we're responsible for creating proprietary studies looking at anything from consumer demographics, so youth, which I spoke about today, in this particular Gen Z, but mothers, affluence, through to category reports. So we've looked at shopping, wellness, etc. And each report, we typically interview around between 30 to 40,000 people globally, so they're big, robust reports. And then we typically combine that with some kind of innovative qualitative methodologies. So we have both the quant and the qual to give us a really good and well-rounded understanding of what's going on and culture at large and how that impacts consumer behaviour and ultimately what that means for brands.
We talked earlier about innovative way that you actually did some recent research into Gen Z. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Definitely. I think one of the most ambitious projects we've recently done, which was for our Truth About Global Brands project, which was where we wanted to understand some of the macro global forces and local forces that have changed over the past 3 years since we first did the research. And we had a huge, robust quantitative piece to go along with it, but qualitatively, we really wanted to understand what's happening at a local level. And being a part of a rather large network, we obviously have an incredible employee workforce at our fingertips. So we did something called Truth About the Street, where we sent every single employee from our global CEO, chairman, right down to the receptionist, which was about 20,000 people in almost, I think, 75 markets. And we sent everybody onto the street to go and interview people in their local neighbourhoods to really understand kind of some of the human richness and qualities that I think really informed the study in quite a unique way.
And you mentioned that you can get the data from a quantitative standpoint, but you don't get that human aspect. Is that correct?
Exactly. I think for me, data is incredibly informative and it always paints a really macro rich picture, but it gives you the what. It doesn't always give you the why and what is kind of some of the underlying causes of how people are reacting to these big shifts that we're seeing in society at the moment. And that human nature of it, you can only get face to face.
Absolutely.
Critical.
What unique factors are there that are driving Gen Z, that are separating them from millennials, Gen X, and so forth?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And in our research, what we're always primarily concerned with are two things. One is, what are the things that remain the same? And actually, there's so much about Gen Z. They're human beings who want to find love, a great job, they want to find their friends, they want to find out what their place is in the world and their values. And that is as true today as it always has been. But obviously, there's a lot that differentiates them. They're a generation that have grown up in the throes of a global financial crisis, in huge socio-cultural movements with terrorist attacks. So much has informed their formative years. So they're incredibly, I think, pragmatic, they're incredibly considered, they're incredibly hyper-aware with what's going on in the world. And they assume nothing. They come at it at a really, I think, humble point of view, wanting to learn more, wanting to be informed. And for me, that makes them an incredibly inspiring cohort of people to kind of talk to, because really what they want to understand is thinking about how they can make a difference in the world as a collective. We're seeing a shift away from the individual generations of previous times, but really thinking about social equality, inclusivity, diversity, and for them that's absolutely paramount.
It's been said that Gen Z is the first truly digitally native generation. They've literally never known a world without the internet. I've seen reports that said that they can only comfortably stay away from the internet for sometimes less than a day, more like the 8-hour area time frame. How does this affect their worldview, this seeing it through a digital lens?
Yeah, I mean, we typically think of them as accessibility natives. So they've grown up having able to have access to anything, anytime, at any place. And that for them is totally normal. You know, the idea of being on or off the internet just doesn't exist for them because we see it as a tool in older generations. For them, it's just a part of their everyday life. And I think that impacts brands two ways. One is that because they have this constant access to everything, they expect to be able to access brands very quickly in any way that they want, whether that's in a very fast, quick motion. But if there is something that really engages them, they want to be able to kind of go deep dive into that content and immediately as well. But it's also, I think, made some really significant impacts on how they're forming their own identities as well, because they live their lives on social media, whereas many of us, you know, found our identities in who we were, and then we presented that on social media. The inverse is true for Generation Z. You know, they're shaping who they are on social media, they're testing out different facets of their personality, and that informs how they're seen in the real world. So really this kind of access and this always on, I think, is for them incredibly natural, but it is obviously impacting their behaviours quite differently from previous generations.
So whereas with our generation perhaps social was more of a tool, for them it's literally the air they breathe.
Totally, yeah. I think for them it's, you know, I did some groups last week and, you know, teens were telling me, 13-year-olds, and they're like, you know, when they come home from school, they have one conversation. That conversation is a group conversation with all of their friends, but it happens across Snapchat, iMessage, Instagram, and WhatsApp, all at the same time, all just jumping from different platforms, but it's one continuous conversation for them. So something that would be incredibly confusing and probably quite exhausting for us is so natural for them. And I think thinking about how you leverage platforms and different mediums in that way to be totally seamless is what naturally kind of works for them.
We're reading and hearing so much about a crisis of trust, just in general, that brands are dealing with across the spectrum of whether it's social or advertising or news, what have you. What has McCann found about this crisis of trust?
I think it's really interesting to see how people are kind of responding to kind of macro cultural forces that are happening, and that's really been informed by huge political changes around the world, by huge socio-cultural movements, even natural disasters. All of these things have had a huge impact in terms of how people view the world at large. And in fact, you know, at a macro level, they're pretty nervous about what's going on. The closer to home they get when thinking about their own personal environment, they're much more positive. But overall, we've seen huge shifts where people are becoming more pessimistic. They're starting to want to put themselves first above all else. They're becoming generally more nervous about the world around them. And we had a statement which was like, my home is my sanctuary because the world is a scarier place. And that's really high levels of agreement. The surprising thing for me, despite all these shifts we've seen, is that brands are still seen as being beacons of trust. In fact, when we ask people what's the number one adjective you'd use to describe a successful brand today, it's trustworthy. So for me, it's a great opportunity for marketers, a great opportunity for brands, that they can be these kind of beacons of trust, as I said, in a world that's changing and people are becoming more reticent about and questioning media or questioning lots of things around them.
It's fascinating that whereas maybe 20 years ago they clung to the government or they clung to some other establishment, and now it's primarily the brands that they believe in.
People different actions in terms of what a brand should do versus what a government should do. And in fact, we gave people a long list of different actions that either should do. And for me, normally when we ask these types of questions, we get kind of shades of grey in terms of, you know, who should do what. With this question, we saw two very distinct answers. For brands, it was all about having a much more human, empathetic role. So whether it's spreading laughter, joy and happiness was number one, reminding families to spend time together was two, looking at how you can reduce stereotypes and bring people together. So this really amazing human relationship that brands have permission to play versus governments, which was much more sort of stick beating and enforcing legislation and enforcing social equality and reducing crime. So I think brands in that position have, you know, the responsibility almost, I think especially in North America, to just take a stand and be able to be that kind of beacon of hope in many places.
And that leads to my next question is we've started to see some of these global brands, Nike, Patagonia, et cetera, taking social stands or political stands even. Do you see that occurring more often as we continue to go forward? And is that what brands need to consider is, are we going to take a hard stand on a topic?
Yeah. I think consumers, especially in North America, it does vary around the world, expect brands to stand up for what they believe in. And I think that is critical, and it's got to be something that aligns with their overall mission. It can't be just taking a stand because you think it's what everybody's doing at the moment. It's got to be aligned to what you truly believe in as a brand. That being said, it doesn't need to be divisive. You can take a stand in a really positive way and in a really inclusive way and have a really strong message which still impacts people.
Let's go back to Gen Z for a moment, given some of the points that you've made. So how do you advise clients, et cetera, brands in general to reach this generation, given that they have a high level of distrust, however, they want brands to actually make a difference in their lives?
I think, people, especially younger generations, are looking for brands that align with their values. They truly believe that the brands they buy say something about them, and they actively want to choose a brand that offers an experience and a community that aligns them with those broader values. If you're doing that as a part of a brand trying to appeal to Gen Z, you're really going to start attracting your core users. I think in terms of how successful brands, I always use Fenty Beauty. It's a brand that comes up in every group I do with younger teens. That is a company that has inclusivity built into its very DNA. It represents and has products for everybody across the board. It celebrates a really kind of diverse and inclusive society. And that for Generation Z is absolutely a paramount. Equality is, truly non-negotiable for them.
Talk a little bit about personalization. That seems to be the next great frontier. Some would say you go from having one website for 1 million people to 1 million websites for that many people.
Yeah.
Each one customized to that particular person. Is that something Gen Z just expects? They just see that as the natural evolution of where we are right now?
Yeah, I think, Gen Z have been brought up in a way that they expect to be marketed to. They've been brought up on social media in an environment where, of course, brands are going to be savvy to your behaviours. And almost if you don't get a tailored ad, why are you advertising to me? They expect that level of personalisation.
Particularly as personalization relates to privacy. That doesn't seem to be as much of an issue for Gen Z as it does for some of the older generations. They don't mind exchanging some of their privacy for customized, personalized experiences on the web. Do you see that continuing, or is that just sort of a blip on the radar?
No, I think that value exchange of where I give you some of my data for a lot of value in return, and that's personalization, it's customizable content, it's lots of different things. I think Gen Z expect it. Marketing to this audience without a tailored message for them just seems like a waste. I think one of the biggest shifts we've seen is that historically we marketed to people, a mass audience with a very individual message. For this audience, it's flipped. I think through the technologies available, through their expectations, we can market to them in a very individual level, but the message is one of a collective. They're primarily concerned with their social equality and being able to promote that much more inclusive group voice. So that, for me, is one of the big shifts that we're starting to see. Not only are they expecting brands to be able to tailor their content to them, but the next phase for me is for them to be able to choose their own tailored version of that content. So Netflix announced with their latest series of Black Mirror the Customize Your Own Adventure, which of course allows you to choose the content and the ending that you want. And I know that's been experimented with before, but I think the full promise of that technology and that ability to customize will only increase in the next few years.
One of the hardest questions we like to ask is there a favorite book or podcast that you would like to recommend to our viewers?
For sure. Does it have to be related to...
Doesn't have to be related to anything.
As an English literature student, I'm an avid book lover, and Sally Rooney is an up-and-coming Irish writer who's just released her second book, Normal People, which is staggeringly good. And her first conversation with friends is also good. It's a real, absolutely acute, beautiful look at just the smallness of everyday life and how people exist and the relationships between them.
Fantastic. Our guest today has been India Wooldridge with McCann Truth Central. India, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.